All right, so it's 7:15. Good to go, right? Amina, just give me the thumbs up from your side. You're ready to go, right? I would think so. Okay, I think we're good to go. You're obviously muted from your side, right? Okay, let's get going right away. So when I was asked by the Menara Chamber to say, Ashraf, can you moderate the session? The obvious thing is like, goodness, I've got so many counter attractions. It all depends on what the topic's all about, right? If it's something rather parochial, then like maybe not. We'll leave it for somebody else, right? When I was told we're going to talk about, effectively the state of South Africa and the way forward, well, I mean, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? That it's something that I think resonates with everyone in the space. But if it doesn't, it certainly should resonate with everybody in the country, because it has to be the number one topic of the country. If, for example, in 2010, we were talking about how well we do in the World Cup, right now is how well are we doing as a country and why are we where we are? So it's really, really important. And the question is really, I mean, let me just set it up for you, like, where are we headed, right? So let me give you the scenario. I mean, we're a country, and maybe the vision of a country with potholes reflects exactly where we are, because some of the potholes are small and some are larger. Some damages your tires, some damages your entire car, some puts you into real risk of your life, and some of it just renders you handicapped forever. And all those things poses different levels of danger, and with it comes different levels of anxiety. Now, clearly, I'm not talking about potholes. I'm talking about the country. And I think the euphemism of potholes is particularly important, because what are we trying to do as a country? We're trying to navigate the potholes that appear to come up every few meters in our country, and get to a situation where either we are wonderfully skilled at navigating the potholes, or the more obvious one is we eliminate the potholes. Right now, we have far more potholes than we really need, and it's a huge cause for consideration. So that much we know. I don't even think we can even debate whether our country right now is a country full of potholes, whether the country has been broken to a large degree. I think that's not a debate, because that answer will be given very, very quickly, right? We know that. The bigger issue really is, where are we headed, right? If you can just please be on mute so that we've got you all silent, right? So that much we know. Now, I tweeted today, in fact, I said something like, let's agree that so much of our country is broken. Let's agree on that. Yet I also said that I love my country, and I love the fact that when South Africans, both at home and globally, really excel, it's something that gives me this massive thrill, gives me a thumbs up, and hopefully does it to you. The question, therefore, for someone like myself, and I like to think for you as well, like, so how do we get South Africa working again? How do we remove the potholes so that we can be on this highway and be free from the considerations of potholes and just drive beautifully? How do we get to that situation? How did we get into this situation? How do we get out of it, right? And that's the considerations we have. How do we keep the lights on? How do we ensure that we have the type of leadership that believes and is committed to the entire country and not just to a few people? How do we ensure that we as a people, as a country, are given hope to a position where we are now experiencing a sense of hopelessness? And I speak as a patriot. I speak as someone who believes in the country. So if I say that, then what about the many others who are not even in this webinar? What are they thinking about the country right now? So there are huge challenges around that, okay? So with that in mind, I think it's a particularly important conversation we can have. I've been told that from the Menara Chamber side, it's the first of many conversations like this. So maybe today is a broad view. There'll be some narrow views looking at very specific issues in our country as we move down the line, not just today, but certainly beyond it, right? So the bottom line, how do we move South Africa forward? And that's the big topic, right? So in doing that, there's an important consideration. One is the hashtag Essay the Way Forward. Please make a note of it. Hashtag Essay the Way Forward, because what I'd like you to do, obviously you can comment on this webinar, but at the same time, even beyond the webinar, you can post comments on social media platforms, wherever you are, and do use that hashtag Essay the Way Forward. Now, the second part of the conversation is where I fit in, not just as the facilitator or moderator, but as someone who heads up a project called Champion South Africa. So we have a vision. We're not part of the political space, We'll be part of the citizenry. We have a vision. We want to build South Africa into a champion nation. We want to look forward to the day where the UN Secretary General announces to the world to say, this year's champion nation is South Africa. And that means this country has ticked all the boxes that is necessary to be titled as a champion nation. So where do we fit in on that? We are centered on building the champions that build a champion nation. And that means speaking to people like yourself. You need to be the champions in your space and in the entire country. And if we all do that and we multiply that like 1 million people and 5 million people, then we get into a level where we could start seriously thinking about us as becoming this champion nation. So therefore, the natural tie-in with South Africa, the way forward, and Champion South Africa, and therefore the collaboration between Champion South Africa and the Minara Chamber of Commerce, I think is a pretty obvious one. And I'm very privileged as the champion spotter at Champion South Africa to be part of tonight's conversation. Now, the conversation is pretty tight. We've got 4 speakers, 15 minutes each maximum. If you speak longer than that, you'll be told and put to order. If you speak less than that, well, that's cool as well, right? But if you speak less than 5 minutes, we're going to be pretty disappointed because we believe that you've been chosen because you have a lot to say. You're all thought leaders in your space, right? So 15 minutes max on a very specific topic. We'll have 5 minutes after that, immediately after the presenter presents for Q&A, and that could take the form of 2 ways. It could be people in this webinar who may comment on the chat line, and we'll pick out a couple. And if you don't, it'll leave it up to me to just ask you a couple of questions. But it's going to be pretty tight because we want to end up, just beyond 8:30 or so and not much longer than that, right? Beyond that, let me tell you, of course, this entire webinar is recorded. It's recorded and therefore streaming live right now on Facebook, the Minara Chamber Facebook account. But post this event, it will be on the Minara Chamber YouTube account. And perhaps if I bend, if I twist the arms of the Minara team, we'll put it on the Champion South Africa social media groups as well, because I think it's really important we do that, right? In terms of the speakers, right? We've got 4 speakers. Ibrahim Fakir, who's the director of ASRI, Imran Bakis, who's a senior research associate also at ASRI, so 2 of them from ASRI, Zakir Avadi, who's the campaign manager at Defend Our Democracy, and Rashad Amra, who's the visiting researcher for the public economy projects at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University, a place that I was there quite recently, about 2 months ago, I think it is. So that's the 4 speakers, okay? So let's get right away into the situation. I think I want to just double check we're going to start with, I know Ibrahim was going to come in slightly later, so we're going to start with Imran, is that correct?
Yeah.
Imran, if I've got that right, okay? Okay, because I see Ibrahim now, but perhaps he needs to breathe just a second or 2, right? So there are many aspects when we talk about a nation that's broken, a nation that needs to be fixed, a nation that moves on to a position of the way forward. And for me, it's even more broader when we talk about suddenly getting to this ideal of a champion nation, well, sometime down the line. Many aspects, but we focus on 4 particular aspects that we think that are particularly relevant for now. The one is the political climate. What is the political climate of South Africa right now? And what are the scenarios that present themselves as the political parties battle for their own spaces to trying to get into government, and those outside of government, what are they trying to do? And all of them have something in common. They've been put into their positions because people like me and you, in fact, have voted for them in some form or the other. So let's start then with Imran Bakis from ASRI. I can tell you, Imran, I certainly, not just from the ASRI part of you, but certainly when you write pieces that I often read in the Sunday papers, they are collector's items. You need to know that because I tend to pull them up and just keep them for other form of research that I need to do. So that's something that you need to know. You come with a big reputation, right? So first up, you've got 15 minutes to talk about the political climate of South Africa. Dr. Imran Bakis, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Ashraf. Thanks for that warm introduction. So I thought what I'll do is talk a little bit about the sort of history that shapes, how we got to where we are. And I want to use the formal part of the presentation to talk about that. And perhaps to start by saying that when we look at South African history, I would characterize it as a history shaped by 4 broad strands of nationalisms. And these nationalisms, three of them I'd describe as narrow and exclusive. And these would essentially be the sort of ethno-nationalisms of the Afrikaner, English, and the Zulu. And we had a fourth nationalism that was embracing, that people embraced irrespective of color, and that would be the sort of African nationalism that we had emerging in the early part of the 20th century. So in many ways, I'd say that the central drama of 20th century politics in South Africa was the struggle of these contending nationalisms for political supremacy. And I think the relevance of what I'm talking about will perhaps surface as we go along. So like I suggested, two were narrow forms of nationalism, the Afrikaner and the Zulu. And each of these had political parties attached to them. We know that the Afrikaners had the National Party and the Zulus had the Inkatha Freedom Party, which eventually become allies. And they failed to overcome the majority nationalism of the ANC. But we also know that in 1910, we have the Union of South Africa, white nationalism coming together. And in 1912 is perhaps the immediate African response to that. The formation of the South African Native National Congress, later to be known as the ANC. And I think many of us know that history, initially a really conservative organization, and resurrected in the 40s by the ANC Youth League and people like Mandela, Luthuli, Walter Sisulu, and others. And that's the kind of history that we come from. And I think the important point to remember is that, that was the political drama of the 20th century, which of these nationalisms emerged victorious. And I think we were quite fortunate that the African embracing form of nationalism emerged victorious in 1994. And perhaps there are two other points that we need to factor in when we look at the ANC and its history as a liberation movement. It, of course, has a really tremendous history. I would think perhaps the greatest liberation movement on the African continent, certainly the oldest. But two pivotal moments in its history that I think we need to talk about. One is 1969, the Morogoro Conference, and the other is 1985, the conference that happens in Kabwe in Lusaka. Both of these are significant, I think, because they also talk about how embracing the ANC becomes. Up to 1969, non-Africans are not allowed into the membership. 69 is a turning moment for the ANC. And 85 is a turning moment because non-Africans are also allowed into the executive and into the leadership. And we see the likes of Mac Maraj and others emerge. And the reason I mention all of this is because there's a sense in the country now that we are returning to that narrow, exclusionary, Africanist nationalism that we see all around us. And I think perhaps one key indicator of that is if we look in the last few decades, we have the lowest number of non-Africans in the NEC of the ANC. And maybe the other question we should be asking ourselves today, as many of us are despondent and disillusioned, is what happens to liberation movements? Why do they implode? And many of these answers are available to us in the history of Africa. For one, I'd like to talk about the broad characteristics of liberation movements. If you take the ANC, ZANU or KANU or any of the other liberation movements, they have two tendencies. One is they have both democratic and authoritarian tendencies. Of course, they strive to be democratic. They fight a gallant struggle for liberation. But they also, particularly in the exile tradition of liberation movements, and if we look at the two traditions of the ANC, the exile and the internal tradition, we have seen levels of authoritarianism in the ANC, throughout its history. For a vast part of its history that goes back to very much of the 1900s. The second is liberation movements, when they come to power, they want to consolidate the middle class. And I think liberation movements need to do that unapologetically. And we've seen the ANC arguably have a huge success when it comes to that. You have a middle class of about 300,000 in 94. And depending on whose figures you read now, perhaps Roger Southall offers the most credible figures. And the middle class today would be about 5 to 6 million. So a massive swelling of the black middle class, 94 to now. But the one problem with how that middle class is being consolidated is that, of course, people in post-colonial societies strive to the state because the state is a facilitator of social mobility. So if you want the BMW and you want the new iPhone, you need to be in state because it's the fastest way of facilitating mobility. But that consolidation of the middle class has largely been accomplished, well, perhaps not largely, but to a significant degree, accomplished by the looting of the public purse. And we see that increasingly as our despondency grows. And the third point, perhaps, with liberation movements is that they tend generally to have an uneasy relationship with the Constitution. Now, yes, we celebrate in South Africa, you know, our Constitution and our constitutional democracy and how that has eclipsed the sort of narrow parliamentary exclusionary democracy that we've had, well, not democracy, that we've had historically. But despite that, liberation movements tend to see themselves as custodians of the post-colonial order and sometimes tend to see the Constitution as an impediment to what they call development. We also know that what we see happening with the ANC today is not uncommon. 3, 4, 5 decades into power, liberation movements do tend to get pushed to the periphery. From Ghana perhaps as a very short period, to Kenya, to UNIP in Zambia, 1991. And, we can trace several examples on the African continent where liberation movements do tend to get pushed to the periphery. Of course, I know you're going to offer the counter argument of Southern Africa with Frelimo, SWAPO, ZANU, etc. But the reason that these liberation movements tend to get pushed to the periphery is, one, the aura of liberation wears out. And we're starting to see that, right? That people care less about how long you spent on Robben Island, but people are increasingly concerned about the potholes and, having jobs. People are less concerned with us showing off about a great constitution because the retort would be, we can't eat the constitution. So the aura of liberation starts to wear out, and all of these romanticized constructions of liberation do start to wear out. You might well say, well, don't we have the ingredients for a revolution? I mean, don't we have many Mohamed Bouazizis in South Africa? And youth unemployment and poverty are, arguably the key drivers of revolution. But what has held us together so far has maybe been liberation dividend, what we call liberation dividend, the idea of giving gratitude to the liberation movement for bringing us liberation. Right? So I think, what we see happening with the ANC today, if we had to draw our understanding from the history of Africa and the history of liberation movements, perhaps even in Asia and in other parts of the world, the one exception might be Mexico, where the liberation movement stayed in power for about 7 decades. But generally, this is the life of a liberation movement. They kind of self-implode. So, I think that history for me, might not be very important for too many people, but I think that history is an important framing to understand where we are today. And we see that starting to manifest in so many ways. We have multiple ANCs, we have multiple South Africas. We have a South Africa where, if you think of South Africa as an inverted pyramid, where the wealthy are at the top and the poor are at the bottom, Historically, the base of the social strata, black and poor, and the apex, white and wealthy. You now have this massive middle class explosion that I spoke about, the 5 to 6 million middle class, black middle class that are having this mobility. And the impact of that is not always positive. It is positive perhaps at the apex, where deracialization tends to occur, and therefore you see white and black sipping wine and having dinners together because they speak the same class language. Whereas at the base of the social strata, you're having a level of re-racialization because there's a huge contestation for survival. What does this all mean for us today, and what does it mean for 2024, and what are the solutions? Quite honestly, I don't know. I don't know what the solutions are. I don't know what the way forward is. But I do think there are some possibilities that could emerge. There's a much talked about possibility that the ANC has already anticipated a loss in 2024. There are a range of figures bandied about by various polls, ranging from the late 30s or mid 30s to the late 40s. Whatever it is, it seems like the ANC is talking about or already considering that a coalition with the EFF could ensure its political longevity. And I'm not going to talk about the Mashatile Malema potential because much has been said already about that, what Mashatile's ascendancy could mean for the EFF. The other possibility is an ANC Democratic Alliance coalition. Not much has been spoken about that because, in large part, people say there isn't the political appetite for that. And the DA has maybe gone down the road of Zilla's dubious racial politics too far. Although, Mpho Phalatse perhaps offered some reassurance in an interview she did yesterday with JJ Tabane. But the DA itself doesn't offer too much hope. I think it hasn't shown great potential to go above the 25% mark. South Africa is a country of young people, 50% under 30, and about 70% of that 50% segment largely unemployed and desperately poor. And the DA has shown no potential or very little potential to capture that. So I've spoken about the EFF ANC possibility, the ANC DA possibility. Those are the first two I would talk about. I'd like to offer a third one that I know Ibrahim Fakir and others may disagree with, and that is the idea of a space for a left bloc. We know if you analyze the NEC, the left has been purged from the NEC. COSATU, the SACP, almost completely purged from the NEC. But if you drill down in the figures, I mean, I have a left leaning, so perhaps biased here. But if you drill down into the figures, membership figures, you'd find that COSATU has a membership of about 1.8 million, SACP about 340,000, SAFTU about 800. And whether or not you want to count the biggest social movement in the country, Abashali, is left to you, but it's about 100 or 120,000. That brings us to a figure of 3 million. And I know belonging to a formation, of course, does not always translate into electoral support. But the argument I make is that there's huge possibilities on the left of the political spectrum. And I've made the argument years ago that if the ANC is challenged, that challenge is likely to come from the left as opposed to the right. And here I place the DA on the right. So if you have a potential electorate of 3 million, of course, that has huge electoral possibilities. But for me, the left, and I can't see it happening before 2024, but if it were to happen, it also offers coalition possibilities for the ANC. And for me, that would be a better possibility than the EFF. The counter argument, of course, is that people who belong to COSATU also belong to the ANC. So, what would that mean in electoral politics? I'm not going to talk about defend our democracy, because I think Zakira is a lot more qualified and knowledgeable to talk about that. So I'll leave her to give us some insights into that. But I think the other civil society formations like the Rivonia Circle, broadly progressive hope that it offers. Of course, it lacks the name recognition, it lacks a broader network. But I think if people in the Rivonia Circle can start to talk about other people in our society that have great credibility, people like Mark Haywood, Kumi Naidu, Zbu Sikode, and many others, I think there's potential for a possibility that comes from that, maybe not an ideologically aligned electoral possibility, but certainly an electoral possibility nonetheless. The one danger that I'd like to point out is that in the context of unemployment, disillusionment, society can often look to right-wing authoritarianism. And we're also seeing society look to left-wing authoritarianism in the form of the kind of proto-fascism of people like Malema. And that risk is always worsened in a society like ours, where the ruling elite is often perceived to be distant from people. And we've seen what happens when people are disillusioned in countries like India. They opt for Modi. Previously in Brazil, they go the Bolsonaro route. In the US, Trump, the previous head of state in the UK, etc., the Philippines. And we can quote, multiple other countries. But I think that's what happens when people are disillusioned. You might have a figure like Mashaba or anyone else that emerges, and people tend to look, bar the substance, to those possibilities as a way out of our deep crisis. So, Ashraf, I think I'll leave it there, and happy to pick up the discussion or questions that emerge from the discussion.
Okay, great. So that's great. So we did leave it open to people asking questions. If they wish to, they can do it via the chat line only. And then we'll pick out a few if you do so. But in the absence of that, I'm absolutely great asking questions. I love that privilege of doing that. So Imran, let's pick out a couple of things, Ron. One, you spoke about the left, and you gave the example of the COSATU left and perhaps the SACP and maybe others that have been aligned, trade union movements, right? But yes, and then you touched to a degree on the left of the as the EFF, right? So since the theme of tonight's discussion is all about the way forward, right? What do you think is going to happen in 2024? And the problem is, if you say, I don't know, then people are going to switch off because they're going to rely greatly on someone like yourself to map out a scenario for us.
Yeah, Ashraf, are you asking what happens in the context of the EFF?
Well, first of all, maybe in the context of the country. So if we're saying the way forward, what's the likely scenario in our next big, signpost, which is 2024?
Yeah, so those were the sort of 3 or 4 possibilities I gave, right? One is that I think it goes without saying that the ANC has reached, its sell-by date, and that happens with liberation movements generally. Of course, the ANC could shock us, and depends on its mobilization on the ground, how well its electoral machinery works, its campaign machinery works. Who knows? It could use it's the fact that it's rolled out social welfare, it's bucked the international trend. I can't think of a country in the world.
But I mean, at this point in time, would you say it's a safe bet to say they will not get 50% plus one?
I think that's a distinct possibility, right? But I'm saying depends on how its electoral machinery works. They could shock us, and the ANC is really great at this mobilizing and demobilizing. But yes, I think all things considered, the ANC is likely to come below 50% in 2024. And one of the immediate coalition possibilities is that possibility with the EFF. And
so let's talk about that. I mean, the EFF today, ahead of the planned protest, Julius Malema effectively saying, we're not even applying for permission because we're not having a march, we're protesting. And that comment effectively, in many ways, reflects their position that they've taken for a long time, being, having a vision, but clearly being very disruptive, to use marketing speak, in the political space, right? So how do you see this marriage playing out between the ANC and a leftist EFF from the ANC point of view, only because the ANC needs to want to retain power?
Yeah, so Ashraf, I mean, you get different forms of leftism, right? And I'm not sure how you're characterizing the EFF, but for me, the EFF is a left-wing authoritarian organization. I certainly wouldn't, place it in the same category as organizations that, for example, have a left that comes from a radical humanism, for example. But certainly, left authoritarian. It's dangling at the 10% mark, and at best I think would go to 13-14%. So it's not showing great electoral possibilities in terms of a huge mark up or a huge increase in its voter base. But that doesn't matter, because if that mathematical permutation is a pretty simple one. If the ANC comes to 40% and the EFF has the 10 or 12%, it certainly is an easy marriage of convenience politically, because all the ANC needs is that 10 or 12%. So I think that would be the easiest way for the ANC to ensure its political longevity. Of course, not everyone in the ANC, and there are multiple ANCs. The idea that the ANC is one big voice is certainly not true. The ANC has been reduced, I think, not to factions, but to a party that changes on a daily basis, and all driven by the politics of patronage, and a very crude politics of patronage. So I think, that would be the first distinct possibility, the coalition between the ANC and the EFF. But I offered, Ashraf, to problematize it, that counter narrative of what I'm...
Okay, we'll just appear to have lost Dr. Imran Bakr just for a moment. Okay, we got you back. Go ahead. Yeah.
Could offer as a coalition possibility.
All right, we just lost you for a sec, but it's fine, right? But perhaps I'll just pick up on this point, then I'll pick up a question from one of the members of the audience, right? So the chances of a coalition appears greater than it's ever been, right? Now maybe it looks like, well, it could well be ANC, EFF, ANC, DA, because of the relative strengths of those parties, right? If we've seen the examples of what's happened in Johannesburg and in the city of Tshwane as well, you're having this amazing scenario where absolute minority parties are able to negotiate themselves into positions of leadership, right? So the question to you is, whether it's DA ANC or EFF ANC, how will that play out to the public? That means, again, if you made the point, it's less about the revolutionaries, but who's going to put food on the table for me? So how will that play out in terms of the practicalities of changing our lives, depending on one of those two scenarios?
Well, I think the ANC EFF coalition will be devastating, because I think in large part that coalition will come together with this united aim of furthering the looting of the public purse. And, it further entrenches corruption as the greatest threat to our society. So I think not only to national security or social cohesion, but in large part, it's going to impact fundamentally on development. And the fact that you see potholed roads and traffic lights not working, I think in all likelihood that will simply increase dramatically with that ANC EFF coalition. So, I think there's a very crude and scary, worrying possibility that awaits us if that, crude nationalism of narrow Africanist nationalism of the ANC.
Okay. I'm sure Ibrahim Hakki will say much. And the ANC DA scenario, very quickly.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what appetite there would be in the ANC for that kind of coalition. I think there are pockets in the ANC that would be open to that, not necessarily ideologically aligned, but I think certainly pockets. But I also don't know how that would play out in the DA electorate. In large part, the DA gets its vote by talking about it, posing, interrupting the political power of the ANC. And if it now goes to bed with the ANC, that might, of course, send a very worrying message to the electorate. Ashraf, I think the one thing we haven't spoken about, and I won't talk about it, is the possibility of the ANC with a number of independents that could emerge. And I think Ibrahim would do a better job of talking about that, because he's done a lot of work around that.
Mhm.
So maybe
Okay, well, I'll tell you what,
possibility
on that point, I mean, interesting, you
you
speak about, you speak about, yeah, whether the DA supporters would even see themselves with the ANC. I mean, we've seen that with Action SA. I think they've lost a key member in Johannesburg or Gauteng on the basis of even, his view versus the Action SA's view regarding having any discussions with the ANC. Now, I know you mentioned Ibrahim Fakir, but here's a question from Solly Moang, who and answer what you can out of this, and others will defer to Ibrahim later on. Solly, good to see you in the space. Solly, of course, a good friend of mine. I haven't chatted to you for far too long. In fact, Solly asking the question: what if something were to emerge to draw broader South Africa to the center and to coalesce to push the ANC out with a clear program? What if the electricity crisis gets used as an excuse to cancel or postpone the elections or to rig them, especially since the IEC is not quite immune from the ANC control? Elections have been manipulated before. Nothing stops this from happening again. Okay, maybe give it to us in a minute, Imran.
Yeah, Ashraf, I missed the first part, but I think Solly was asking about the possibility of a coalition coming together of parties that is able to take the ANC out outright.
Yeah, that's correct.
That means unseating the ANC by, without a coalition, getting 50% plus.
Yeah.
I can't see that happening. With the time left to 2024, we've seen in the last election, for example, where you had a left possibility coming out of NUMSA, and it launched a campaign at the last minute. It did its mathematical permutations. It came to the election. It was a dismal failure. So I think that kind of possibility will require a lot of work. It will require a lot of mobilizing. And we also know that elections can't be postponed. And the court in 2021 already ruled that that's not possible. So it means that we have very little time to the next election, and I can't see any political permutation that can emerge between now and then that could oust the ANC.
Okay.
The second distant possibility remains the DA, and it's a very, very distant possibility.
Okay, Dr. Imran Bakis, for now, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. So applause to you. Much appreciated. Stay in the space, you're there, but also feel free, besides your analysis in sort of pieces on the weekend, feel free to also tweet that using the hashtag SA the way forward. I'll certainly look out for that. Right. Okay, let's move on to the second of the four speakers we have, and that's Zakir Abadi. Of course, I know Zakir initially from obviously the obvious connection with the dead Ismail Vadi, but perhaps more importantly, she's played an important role at the Kathrada Foundation, but now her role as programs coordinator at Defend Our Democracy, I think is something that certainly piques my interest, because the suggestion of the name Defending Our Democracy suggests that democracy itself is at stake. But the broader question about what she's going to talk about is really the role of you and I outside the traditional party political spaces. We're talking about active citizenry and what are the citizens and what can and can they not do. So Zakir, I appreciate your time. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Like Imran, I think I'm just going to touch very slightly on the past, because it is important in terms of civil society movements going forward. So I think that the anti-apartheid struggle characterizes our understanding here in South Africa about what civil society or civil society movements are. Of course, there are international examples, both of the past and more recently. For example, the Arab Spring, the Black Lives Matter movement that we may reflect on. But from a South African experience, I think both the Black Consciousness movement as a start, as well as the UDF, present some form of, examples or lessons that could be learned. And that's where I think we need to perhaps reflect on the past and draw on that as we build towards the future. So there's really two observations or three observations in relation to particularly the UDF, and it is the 40th anniversary of the UDF, so I'm going to reflect on that for a bit. At the time when the UDF was formed, political formations, particularly liberation movements, were underground. Parts of their structures couldn't operate freely. And in that context, what was the role of civil society? And I think today we see that, but in a very different way, where political parties, political actors are often discredited by society, often have to take stances that are in the interest of their political parties and not necessarily the interest of people. So what role does civil society play now? Thereafter, I think we need to look at the range of organizations who form part of the UDF. So I've heard of a local netball club in Indonesia that was part of the UDF, and it went all the way down to community level. Similarly, the people leading the UDF at the time, yes, there was an older leadership, but someone like Vali Musa just in this year was speaking about it and said that he was in his 20s, and already at the time he was one of the national organizers of the UDF. And lastly, that this movement was national. It cut across all sorts of geographical boundaries, but importantly, it was non-racial as well. And it almost in its own being began to create a vision for what South Africa should look like. Yes, it came with problems as with any other movements, and I think that those can be reflected on as well. But I thought to start off with that and then look at where all of this went to from there. So immediately after democracy, there's a general view that civil society fragmented. Many civil society activists at the time, those who were in leadership positions, went into formal politics, and that left somewhat of a vacuum. At a community level as well, you saw, for example, residents' associations slowly disintegrating, and a lot of emphasis on the role of the state and what government could provide at the time. However, the period slightly after that, so the mid-90s to the latter part of the 1990s and thereafter, I think we begin to see again a re-emergence of stronger civil society movements, Treatment Action Campaign being one of those who I think did phenomenal work at the time and was one of the biggest, I think, in the post-apartheid era in South Africa. Most of the people on this call and on Facebook would probably remember the more recent period of civil society organization in the country. So if we look at the latter part of the Zuma period, the calls that were made for Zuma to step down after he was found to have violated the constitution. And thereafter, I think that built momentum, and you saw movements like Save South Africa, which was a very new formation, spearheaded by Sipho Pityana, and then later on Future South Africa, together with a whole range of organic organizations that began, or organic activations that began to emerge. Yes, political parties did play an important role, opposition parties, as well as the ANC itself, and those within the ANC who began to call out the former president. So I think that moment really presented a critical shift for civil society. Civil society was no longer just the set of organizations doing work, for example, as a traditional NGO would. There were a few organizations who, like Treatment Action Campaign, who made themselves distinct before that. But the role of organizations like the South African Council of Churches during that period in calling on all of those who had information on state capture to come forward and unburden themselves at a particular panel. We saw the role of organizations who do more analysis, policy-related work, begin to, I think, shape this concept of what state capture means and begin to connect the dots of what was really happening in the country. And I think together with those who were on the inside, a story was built around that. After that, however, it gained a lot of momentum up until Zuma stepped down. I think that there was a Tuma Mina moment that many were caught up, particularly those traditionally within ANC circles. And there was a failure of organizations who were beginning to build a broader cross-organizational base to effectively take forward that movement and to really begin to hold government accountable on a consistent basis. many organizations retreated back into the work that they would have ordinarily been doing, whatever it may be, at a community level, the policy work, the legal work. And it was only, I think, as we saw state capture not really end, but begin to morph into something in a different form thereafter, that organizations began to feel the need to come together again. And what prompted this in many ways was that there was a state capture fight back at some point in time. So this narrative of state capture and calling out those implicated was slowly starting to turn around, and there was a need to come out strongly against that. The Zondo Commission presented an important point for organizations to come together as well. There is what's called a civil society working group of about 20 to 25 organizations who have made submissions to the Zondo Commission, and will look particularly at the area of state capture and the implementation of the Zondo Commission recommendations. And that's the work being led by Open Secrets. Fast forward to the COVID period. It was a completely different scenario for the country, the first time that organizations were working in this scenario. What started off at the time as the Orange Overalls campaign, really prompted by the calls made by Archbishop Thabo Makgoba at the time, morphed into the Orange Mask campaign, and I think drew together a solid crop of almost 100 organizations, including trade unions, those from the business sector, who began to look at the issue of COVID-19 corruption very specifically. This campaign was successful in that it cut across different provinces. It did have some limited public outdoor activations given the COVID crisis. And it really captured the imagination of civil society organizations about what was possible going forward. And I think similarly, if we look at other avenues of work, not necessarily linked to the issue of corruption, but just dispelling the sense of hopelessness that was prevalent during the first period of COVID, that we can't do anything about it. We just have to sort of wait and see whether we get ill or not, came through the CANS initiative. This is the community action networks that were developed in different communities and began to harness the collective energy of people. And I think like that, there were other initiatives by a range of other formations looking at humanitarian aid for people, medical assistance, etc. What this does bring me to is that there are different forms of civil society organizations, some focused on specific themes, some looking at national issues of corruption, of accountability. There are left-leaning organizations that Imran mentioned, and there are right-leaning organizations. So Solidarity, for example, do we consider them to be part of broader civil society if we take into consideration that labor forms within the broader ambit of civil society? AfriForum, and I think that's what I'm trying to get, that it's not necessarily just KSAC or PARI or AUTA, or the traditional civil society organizations that many here on this call I think would be familiar with. And there are other civil society organizations who may have different thinking and may not necessarily be all that positive. So if you look at the recent formation of a civil society organization that is seemingly linked to the RET or RET-related crowd, who would also define themselves as a civil society formation or a civil society movement. Where does that leave us all now? We reached a point probably about 2 years ago where there were a whole range of initiatives underway, specifically on the issues of governance, of corruption. And that led to the point just before the July 2021 uprising. And there was a call thereafter by Reverend Frank Chikane, who brought together a range of organizations and felt that there was a need to stand for something that would draw all of these formations together. And at that time, it was constitutionalism and the rule of law. And again, calling out the kind of violence that was sort of hinted at before the July 2021 uprising, and I think became a reality in July and thereafter. So that's where Defend Our Democracy really kicked off. Started off as a campaign on very specific issues of constitutionalism, the rule of law, corruption, dealing with the kind of narrative that was being presented by Zuma's supporters. And thereafter, I think, managed to bring together a range of supporting organizations and voices from different sectors. Subsequently, we felt that there is an ongoing need to coalesce around these issues. And it's what Solly raised in his question, but not necessarily related to political parties. So we see a need to bring together organizations on different ends of the spectrum. So in a room, we can have, for example, Auta and Helen Suzman Foundation, and we can have Equal Education, even the SACP, and perhaps even Solidarity in the same room on common cause or common issues. So whether people are slightly to the left, slightly to the right, we feel that the best hope that there is for the country, particularly from a civil society perspective, is to bring together people as close together to a center or a centric position, and take forward common causes in the most practical manner. So I don't think that there'll ever really be agreement in civil society on issues of privatization of banks, for example, on difficult issues related to land redistribution. But there can be commonality on the issue of corruption. There can be commonality on the issue of protecting whistleblowers. We slowly beginning to see commonality from a whole range of civil society voices on the issue of electoral reform. And there can be commonality on the kind of crisis that's besetting the country at the moment. Defend Our Democracy hosted a conference in July last year, and it was the Conference for Democratic Renewal and Change. And it really set the ball rolling for some sort of a broad civil society formation that could present this front or a platform for organizations to work collectively on key issues affecting the country. And foremost amongst those was the issue of destabilization and tackling that, the issue of electoral reform and broader political reform, tackling issues of capture and corruption as well. So that's the kind of basic work that Defend Our Democracy is focusing on now. And that conference mandated the campaign, or what was the campaign, to now look at becoming a civil society movement. And that's where we are at present, really beginning to get the nuts and bolts together of movement building. It's an extremely difficult process, given that there are a number of small initiatives across the country, from, for example, in the eThekwini region, a whole range of organizations pulling together to look at their collapsed municipality, to others in Limpopo looking at issues of water and sanitation and potential corruption in that area, to organizations dealing with policy and procurement related work. And we feel that there's now a need to connect the dots and link up these different movements so that there can be cross-organizational learnings that take place, but also a united voice on different issues. Beyond the work of the DoD, and as I indicated, we really just on the brink of launching this movement, and hopefully in the next month or two we can share a bit more information about this. But beyond this, there's also other movements that are being built. There's a youth coalition that's being built by the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation Youth, and last year they brought out I would say close to over 1,000 young people onto the streets of Pretoria. This year, they aim to get that number much higher. And it's a whole range of youth formations that are now looking at working more closely together. The Kagiso Trust recently held a conference where they brought together civil society organizations, primarily those doing NGO community-based work, to come together similarly on common issues affecting the country. And similarly, the Social Justice Assembly by Siri, Pari, Equal Education, and others have also come together to work together to present some sort of a broad platform. All of these initiatives know that they must work together, including the DoD and the list that's there. But I think we haven't yet put in place the mechanisms to establish how that would work. They are open communication, we support each other fully, but I think those mechanisms still need to be established. Just a few more points. One, I think, is related to movements that have been built, or civil society platforms and fronts around specific issues. More recently, there's been the Kopanong formation on the issue of xenophobia and tackling that. Imran mentioned Abahlali, so the Shack Dwellers movement, rural networks, which are often ignored because they're based in rural areas, but very strong membership there. Issues of GBV, electoral reform, anti-racism work, that's the Anti-Racism Network of South Africa, procurement reform, the Zondo Commission. Imran mentioned leftist organizations, and there's active work in terms of movement building there and jointly looking at issues related to, for example, mining communities, historical foundations, so the Kathrada Foundation, Mandela Foundation, and common initiatives amongst those historical foundations. And then there's humanitarian organizations like the Gift of Givers and others who don't necessarily always pronounce on the political issues, but if they pull out of the country, I think that overnight we'd see chaos unfold. So there are a multitude of causes. The question is really, how do we now begin to pull that together? Very quickly, just a few last points. One is that Imran mentioned Rivonia Circle that has now given birth in a way to what is called the RISE movement. And there's debate within civil society on whether there is a need to remain traditionally politically non-partisan or to begin looking seriously at electoral politics and how to get the best within civil society to stand on an electoral platform. And I think the RISE movement is trying to look into that. All of this is extremely important given the crisis that the country faces. So we now have the possibility of a national shutdown and whatever impact it may have. We've seen what the impact of the Nihau strike was. There are regular or yearly fees must fall strikes that take place. And all of this indicates that the crisis is deepening and that, as Imran indicated, there is an implosion of the ANC. And with that comes all sorts of negative consequences for broader society, but also presents opportunities for those in society to mobilize. In a pre-election year, what do we do with this opportunity? How do we learn from other movements that have sprung up in different parts of the world? How do we learn from community initiatives that sometimes you may be on complete opposite ends of the spectrum, but you can come together to fix the pothole down your road? And then, do you really want to fix the pothole down your road when you are paying money to your municipality to do that work? And should you be rather looking at oversight work instead? So I think there's lots of questions that will be facing civil society at this point in time. What I think there is concurrence on is that we are in need of democratic renewal and change. We're really left with questions of how. Do we do this effectively through democratic and constitutional means, or do we just watch things unfold through mass destruction that could be a possibility if the crisis deepens and if there's violent protests that play out? So civil society organizations are left with a question that they really need to be taking a stance on issues. There can't be a sense of ambivalence that prevails any longer. And going back, I think, to the 40th anniversary of the UDF, they are very interesting historical stories, but once again, how do we ensure that those stories are relevant today and we take learnings from it? Thanks, Ashraf.
So Zakira, thanks for that. And again, fascinating insights for those that know and for those that did not know about just these civil society organizations, right? So maybe just two questions to you very quickly. One is, so is our democracy under threat, Zakira?
Our democracy, I would believe, is under threat. We agree, and I think everyone who has suffered due to load shedding or not having electricity at all since the dawn of democracy would agree that that is something that threatens democracy. The issue of corruption threatens democracy. And if political parties are unable to fix the toxicity within the political space and civil society isn't able to exert pressure on them to do that, I think we're in for some very troubling times over the next few years.
And therefore, yes, we don't have time to have this long chat about it, but one may say that just about all these political parties are captured in some form or the other. That means parties captured by members within parties, right? But you don't have to answer that; that'll take too long. Where then does that role put the role of defend our democracy? I mean, you made the point about starting when you did just over a year ago, and now maybe launching it even further, but up to now, it's far removed from grassroots, unless you're going to correct me. So it'll appeal to me. I know exactly what it is, but does it need to impact broad society where society will see defend our democracy and what it stands for, not as a political party, but for all the great ideals that South Africans aspire to, and understand that they are placed alongside political parties, even though they're not in the political space?
So, I take the point where we see defend our democracy playing an initial role is really connecting the array of organizations that are doing vast amounts of work across the country. But there isn't a broad umbrella and overarching political framework without being politically partisan that's guiding that work. So if there are grassroots organizations, for example, that are doing work in the Northwest or in Limpopo, how do we bring them to be part of a broader collective? So I think that's the first thing that we aim to do. And thereafter, we would encourage any sort of civic formations that would organically crop up in communities, and try and learn from the best practices that have been put in place by other organizations over time, and that these newer formations can draw on. So I agree that there is a need to shift towards a more civic perspective, but work like this takes time, a lot of energy, and a lot of education and intensive engagement and consultation as well. So I think I know that there's a crisis unfolding and there's a need for urgency, and perhaps that will spur on some of the work that needs to be done, but it is work that is also slow work that needs to take place.
Okay, and lastly, you made the point about the Sipho Pichana headed Save SA and then Future SA, and then what happened next, right? Critics of civil society may well argue that yes, when President Ramaphosa spoke about his new dawn, that we as civil society and those that defend democracy did not hold him to account, particularly in the first 2 years or so, with the same gusto and vigor that we held President Zuma to account, and we're paying the price for that. So the question to you is you made the point they all took a step back. Why do you think they took a step back when it was so obvious that one person's removal was not going to actually save South Africa?
So I think it does stem from the fundamental belief that people at the time, and by people I both from within organizations and the general public, felt that it probably would turn the tide if one person was removed, without understanding the entrenched capture networks that went into every state-owned entity or many state-owned entities, and now replicated into municipalities, into provinces. So there was, I think, perhaps a naivety at the time that formed that belief. There were others who continued the anti-state capture work at the time, but I would agree with the assessment that there wasn't that intensive accountability that should have been exercised during that period and in subsequent years as well.
Okay, and the big question of the why, maybe we'll leave it to a broader discussion. Zakira, Avani, thanks for your time. Of course, you most appreciated. Great input. And again, feel free. I know you're very active on social media. Feel free to tweet about it as well when you get the opportunity, using that hashtag SA the way forward. So much appreciated. There are questions to you. I suggest you even look at those questions in the chat line. Perhaps you may even want to answer that directly even after this webinar itself, right? Okay, we're going to check out later on about electoral reform, which may be very important in the context of what Zakir has just said with Ibrahim Fakir, but he comes up last. Maybe to leave us something to think about for the future. Let's talk about the really important issue that we often forget about, that one of the biggest issues around 1994, when we attained the right to vote, it didn't sort out economic freedom. And in fact, inequality that existed then perpetuated over a period of time, to the point now 3 decades later, well, I use this phrase very often because it's just so simple to understand, that a township still looks like a township and a suburb looks like a suburb. And when we'll know we've transformed fully is when a township looks like a suburb. And we're well short of that, besides perhaps Vilakazi Street, for example. Right. So with that in mind, our next speaker, Rashad Amra, I think what he has to say is really important around the issues of economics and equality and inequality. He's the visiting researcher at the Public Economy Project, which is based at BIS, part of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. I would think, Rashad, you must be a good chummy of Dr. Pari Lahotla, who's a good friend of mine. Is a good friend of mine because he would speak that sort of language, right? So we're looking forward to what you have to say, not just about the economy, but the oft-forgotten issue of this incredible inequality and the threat and the opportunity that it poses for South Africa.
Okay. Good evening and Assalamu alaikum. Thanks, host and Minara Chamber generally. You started off speaking, Ashraf, about potholes and the analogy of potholes. And so really the question is, I mean, is the economic trajectory of this country allowing us to have less potholes, smaller potholes, more potholes, or is the road going to erode completely? The reality is, I travel quite a bit between our 3 main cities. And some of the suburbs are looking a bit more like townships, and not for the right reasons, right? So, I was in northern suburbs in Joburg recently, and I was quite surprised. So, we don't know the future. We can't prognosticate. But presumably, as a business forum and owners of capital and professionals, Minara, you want to know about what the future holds to guide your investment decisions and whether you should apply for citizenship in New Zealand, like many people I know are. And how to plan for a radically uncertain future. And also as a business forum that is Muslim in terms of its constituency, or largely Muslim, you're also interested in the overall well-being, not just of your businesses or your society, but the overall South African society. In certain senses, that is an imperative. And I think this conversation is very important in that respect. So suffice to say, much of what's going to happen with the economy is not going to be driven largely by exogenous factors or the global economy or the national treasury or Ibrahim Patel in trade and in industry, but is actually going to be driven by the politics of this country. So I think the nature of our institutions and the erosion of institutions and capture of institutions has meant that the politics has a disproportionate influence and effect over economic performance. So I'm going to make a few points about the state of the economy, about the future, which is, I don't know anything about the future, but we can look at the past and look at general developments, and that can inform us. Something about the budget and fiscal sustainability, and then also some points for business to reflect, given that this is a business forum. So in discussing the economy, and I'll make a similar point or similar approach to both Imran and Zakira, we should not just look at 1 or 2 data points. We should take a long-term perspective, because the long-term perspective and long-term developments actually shape outcomes. It's not a blip of a single quarterly contraction that should capture our imagination or lead us to another bout of anxiety, but it's rather how we're doing as a country over a 10-year, 15, 20-year trajectory. So that said, though, the data released earlier this month for 2022 showed economic growth of 2% really. And this follows 4.9% in the previous year. Now, 2% sounds good in the current context, and 4.9% really great for 2021, but you must realize that this comes in the back of COVID, which saw a major contraction in the economy. So right now, as of 2022, the size of the South African economy is the same as it was in 2019. So that sounds good, but you must remember that 2019 wasn't a great year. In the decade preceding 2019, from 2008 to 2019, was the period of the post-financial crisis, where growth was really poor. It was anemic. It was around 1.5, 1.6% for those 11 years on average, which is really, really insufficient for our social challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And so this partial recovery, we've recovered 1.6 million jobs since the beginning of COVID, but we lost 2.3. So the net effect is a negative, a loss of 0.7 million jobs, right? So right now in the economy, there's the unemployment rate. The official unemployment rate is 32%, 7.2 million people. It gets scarier. The official, sorry, I'm getting a message here. Sorry, I can't read the message properly. Is it directed for? So I'm struggling to hear now. Oh, sorry. I thought that was a message.
No, just carry on. Yeah, you carry on.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, you can go ahead, Rashad.
Okay, thank you. So I was talking about unemployment a moment ago and giving you some jolting statistics, and that's just overall unemployment. Right, 10.2 million people in this country. There are unemployed broadly defined. Many of them are just sitting at home. They're part of what's called the discouraged job seekers who can't find work. It gets scarier when you look at youth unemployment. Imran spoke about South Africa being a very young country. Youth unemployment, narrowly defined, this government's official definition, is 45%. When we look at the broad definition, it's 55%. About 7 million young South Africans are unemployed, and they're young. And when you're unemployed, and you're unemployed for a long time, your odds of finding employment in the future close onto zero. And so just the unemployment and the growth statistics are really concerning. We've also seen slowing investment in the country, increasing inequality, increased dependence on social grants. And we've seen a precarious fiscal position of public finances. This year in particular, the Minister of Finance is pushing a very hard line to actually cut. It's a very austere budget, decreasing allocation for key social areas. And the impact of this isn't just in service delivery. The impact on this is also in terms of social unrest. The impact of this is also on the potential for the economy to continue growing, because if you're not investing in the economy, because of the imperative to stabilize debt as a share of GDP, you're actually weakening the country's economic prospects in terms of potential growth. So I painted a pretty depressing picture, and this picture is in direct contrast to the period of 1994 to 2008, so that 14, 15 years, so significant growth, a decrease in public debt, strong employment creation, and those are much stronger years. So if we contrast these two periods, and we ask, like, why was growth so strong then? Why was the state so stable? And why was it a far more optimistic, more hopeful picture compared to the very dismal outlook right now? So if we look at South Africa's current performance and the outlook, which is quite depressing for the medium term, around 1.4, 1.6% growth average over the next 5 years, what are the key factors driving this? So globally, we've seen high commodity prices, which has benefited us certainly last year and the year before. And that's kind of where the good news ends for the outlook. With regards to the global economy beyond commodity prices, there's expected to be weaker global growth, and that affects obviously our exports. But let's just leave the global story for one moment. There's the electricity crisis, right? So it's not even an elephant in the room. Everybody's talking about this. Everybody knows this. Drake's interview was almost another moment for coalescing of civil society, or his tweeting. And so you can't run an economy without electricity. And this problem, has been brewing from about 1998. It started in 2008 properly, and now it's 14, 15 years. There have been some developments to free up generation capacity or allow the private sector to co-generate without caps on generation. There have been some incentives in the budget in terms of solar, but that's not really going to make much of a difference. And an attempt to create, creation of a new portfolio within the presidency to oversee the crisis. The politics and the sounds that have come out of government thus far, and the murmurings from Eskom, suggest that the Treasury plan to provide a loan that could be equity if Eskom plays ball is almost guaranteed to not play out in the way Treasury anticipates it, and which would be the prudent way of proceeding. So if the electricity crisis isn't addressed in a substantial manner over the next 24 years, the growth outlook for the country, and as a consequence, the employment potential for the country is not particularly strong. Right? Then we have state capability. So even prior to electricity crisis hitting this level or this crescendo, state capability has been eroded. Now, state capability erosion is multifaceted. It's partially corruption, partially appointments, partially the politics of this country, and the inability of the economy to create a middle class, and so consequently, cater deployment and the hyper competitive nature of access for resources has further weakened the state's capability, both at the national level, at the municipal level. It's incredible, and to a certain extent the provincial level as well. Then you also have, in addition to Eskom, you've got logistic challenges. You've got the complete destruction of passenger rail. You've got a very weak freight rail. At least, there's have been some attempts to try and bring private provision or private management of national rail. And then you have state capture, which is partially covered in the discussion on logistics and state capability, but also the smaller pool of resources going forward to address many of these challenges. Labor is a challenge, but beyond that, beyond labor's debilitating role in the public sector right now, labor is probably not the highest concern for investment and for growth right now. Our fiscal position I've covered in part, but our fiscal position right now, as Treasury attempts to stabilize debt as a share of GDP, has meant that government's fiscal impulse, so how government stimulates the economy to increase spending, is actually negative. So government's overall impact, statically measured, is actually removing from growth compared to previous years. And this is a very deliberate decision. The idea is if we can stabilize debt as a share of GDP, then we have more resources to allocate to key spending areas, and less resources are then being transferred to wealthy bondholders. As a way forward, I think a lot then depends on the politics of the country, more so than state institutions in terms of the Treasury or the independence of the central bank or provincial education departments. These are second and third order considerations. I think the politics is going to determine the ability of the state to fix itself and start delivering, or continue on this trajectory where there's less incentive for people to actually invest in this country. So with those words, I'd like to open it up for discussion. Thank you, Ashraf, and we'll take questions.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that, Rashad. And again, if people want to ask some questions quickly in the chat line, it has to be linked to economy, inequality. That's the ones that Rashad can talk about. Let's start with one of the last things you said. A lot depends on the politics of the country, right? So we've already played out the scenario early on that we could well have a coalition government, and it could be right of center or left of center, right? Are we saying, and I'm almost sounding naive in asking this question, are we saying that whatever that shape of government is formed will very quickly determine the economic shifts? And if so, what type of economic shifts? So in those two scenarios, how will they play out?
So Zakir started the presentation trying to define civil society. And so I think it would be useful, even though Imran and Ibi are on the panel as well, what does left mean and what does right mean? The EFF is not a left party. The EFF are a bunch of vultures, as Solly has been referring to them on the chat. The EFF are not a progressive party that care about redistribution. They're purely, they're sometimes, I would say the EFF are more capitalist than even, somebody on the JSE. So the EFF is not a left party. They're not progressive. And we've seen, and Imran's written a very nice piece on Nehao. I don't know if Nehao actually care about the average South African. So I think those type of historical binaries, and yes, we use them in our discourse, I use them myself, are sometimes limited. One could even argue that the current mayor of Cape Town, Jordan Hill-Lewis, is way more progressive than Cosatu because he's just trying to create jobs. So even if his attempt to create jobs is not through major redistribution or appropriation of land in sea points, he is creating more jobs, and so he's more progressive over the short run. So with that being said, I think let's park ideology for a bit. It is still important. The politics is just like a commitment to actually rebuild the state and state capabilities. Do textbooks get delivered on time? Are people still using pit latrines? Are there still potholes in the ground? Are people still having to go to 3 Home Affairs departments and take time off work so their son, who's in matric this year, can actually register for his finals? There's no ideology in Aaron Motsoaledi getting Home Affairs wrong. It's just sheer incompetence and indifference to the poor. So, leaving ideology aside, I think the commitment of whoever takes over in 2014 to actually get things fixed will determine a lot. And I think, I don't ever want to underplay the importance of policy, so economic policy, labor policy, monetary policy, macro policy. But I think basics need to be in place.
I love your Freudian slip about 2014 because it gives us a 10-year head start now, right? Like I wish we could go back to 2014 and just relive what we've experienced over these years. Let's talk about the enablers of an economy. Or those that restrict. We spoke about you touched on labor, you touched on, unemployment and those massive numbers of 45% and 55%, especially amongst the youth. One can throw in the fact that many of them are sadly unskilled, right? Then you spoke about electricity and, energy and the transport breakdown in our country, right? And so much more, of course, right? How does one, just on your thoughts from South Africa, perhaps maybe another country's example, have there been examples where despite those impediments or deficits, things can be pulled together very, very quickly? Because as I talk to you, I think there are people in this space, they're looking for that silver lining, and they're hoping that somehow, in what I'm trying to think about it in cricket terms, you're losing the match and a fast bowler takes a hat trick and suddenly the game turns your way. I mean, do we have that hat trick taker?
So, and again, this is a nice segue from the previous conversation. I mean, many of us and maybe civil society took the foot off the gas and thought maybe Cyril was going to be the new god, and he's going to send the evil demons back to banish them to Siberia, and it wasn't that. And so I don't know particularly much about other countries that have managed to turn themselves around, but generally massive changes to a social order in a short space of time have been anti-democratic or non-democratic. I think Singapore, South Korea, Rwanda to an extent, Ethiopia. There's a lot of overlooking basic human and civil liberties to try and create a strong economy. And so by nature, I mean, policy and growth is messy in a democratic setting. So I don't know if of any hat-trick taker. Mbappe had scored a hat-trick for France in the final, and it still wasn't sufficient.
And still lost, yeah. Yeah, good point. Yeah. Sorry, you wanted to say more?
No, I'm covered.
Okay, just a quick one from Mohammed saying, Rashad, is there anything that gives you optimism for the economy?
Okay, well, thanks for asking that question, Mohammed. What has been really wonderful has been Edward Kieswetter at SARS. I mean, we've had to revise on two occasions, both in this budget, but also in last year's MTBPS in October, the revenue estimates for the 2022-2023 financial year. Now, we all remember the role of Jacob Zuma and Tom Moyane and Bain Consultants in the destruction of SARS, which Pravin Gordhan had built to being a world-class, revenue collector. And so in a short space of time, that has been phenomenal. I mean, that has really been phenomenal, the rebuilding of that institution. I'd love to read an MBA case study on how it was rebuilt. I don't fully understand it. And it shows that, over a short space of time, such an important state institution has been rebuilt, has given us fantastic dividends. And that is pretty hopeful. Beyond that, I mean, one stage I thought we're going to frack the Kuru and we're going to become the Qatar or the UAE, but I don't think there is much gas there. And secondly, there's environmental considerations. So economics is called the dismal science, Mohammed, and now you know why.
Okay, Rashad, we can leave it at that. Thank you for your time. Most appreciated, valued input. And again, feel free even to put some comments in that chat line, by the way, but also if you are tweeting, you can tag all of us, certainly tag me, absolutely, that all-important hashtag SA, the way forward, and really trying to find a way to the way forward. So let's bring in the last of the four speakers. We have Ibrahim Fakir. I noticed with amusement, Ibrahim was battling with load shedding. I would have thought that maybe as a protest, Ibrahim, you should actually be talking to us with in darkness, because I mean, that's the reality of what we face every single day. But I'm glad to know that your lights are back on. Ibrahim Fakir is at ASRI, right? Program director at ASRI. And also, I've told you this before, of course, one of the people that whenever Ibrahim speaks on various platforms, I sit up and listen, because he's certainly one of the finest analysts we've had in the country. So great, really privileged to have you in this space. So Ibrahim, welcome. And I'm going to start with an interesting one, because you're going to talk about electoral reform, right? Now, Makashule Gama, who is once of the DA, Ghana rather, once of the DA, and now part of that new Rise movement that's been alluded to. He's hosted a Rise in Mzansi. He's hosted a Twitter space today. And he's asked the question, can change be effected by opting out of democratic processes? I think it's a fascinating segue into where you fit in about electoral reform. So I'll give you your 15 minutes as you can go ahead.
Thanks very much, Ashraf, and thanks for inviting me. Although I would not like to thank you all for giving me the topic which I'm least prepared to talk about. Zakira has been doing quite a bit of work on electoral reform. But let me kick into this and talk about electoral reform and address also some of the other issues which have come up. You'll note that I'm the only one wearing a jacket, and which is why I waited for my lights to come on so you could see that. And that's because Rashad doesn't want us to talk from ideological perspectives, but I'm going to speak for the right wing, and that's why I'm wearing the jacket. And I mean this not because I am right wing. I'm not. On the contrary, I'm actually on the left. But the question of ideology today matters much less because we actually don't have a politics of principle, nor do we have a politics of value. And so any politician, including what Mr. Magashule Ghana says about politicians' approach to wanting to bring about change, is something I would view with a great deal of suspicion. And I'm not alone in this. If you look at any reliable public opinion survey, they repeatedly tell you that the majority of South Africans have absolutely no trust in political parties, and they have no trust in politicians. In fact, the figures are so dismal. If Rashad thinks economics is the dismal science, it seems as if politics is very quickly replacing that. And in fact, these days, I think there's very little political analysis which needs to happen. You actually need more criminology than political analysis. But be that as it may, we're in good company when we have deep suspicions of the political parties. And the suspicion is well-founded. And the nature of electoral reform is a great example for why people are so suspicious of the political parties, without exception, all of them, including the governing party. If you look at what the Constitutional Court said more than 2 years ago, in 2020, in the midst of COVID, it took the parliament and it took the parties which were in parliament more than 2.5 years and 3 Constitutional Court deadlines that they missed successively to fudge and budge this electoral system or the question of electoral reform. And now they are at a point at which they are arguing that they could not consider serious and thoroughgoing electoral reform because the time was just too limited. Well, the reality is that the time was not limited. The political parties wasted the time. I sat in on the first parliamentary committee, and the Constitutional Court judgment is very clear in saying that Parliament must come up with a new system. Guess what the politicians on this committee did? They asked the IEC to come up with a system to recommend to them that they will then debate and deliberate on. So talk about shirking of responsibilities. This is what they did. And extending the theme of shirking responsibilities, what we have today is a politics and a governance which is characterized by the desire for power without responsibility and authority without accountability. And that is what characterizes the nature of our politics today. And anyone who believes that the new electoral system that has been devised or that is going to be passed, and by the way, the president, despite having missed the Constitutional Court deadline, has not yet indicated when he is going to sign this bill into law, defective and problematic as it is, are going to give us much the same electoral system as we have now, and as we've had till now, with even more defects than than there are in the current system. So it's creating a whole lot of inequalities. It is expecting independence in individual people to contest against political parties. The thresholds for entering the electoral space and to contest for political competition is incredibly limited. The minister is promising that there may be more thoroughgoing reform in the future. Yet there are people who are saying, no, whatever reform we get now is going to bring about some glimmer of hope, because you will have individuals of the caliber of Zaki Ahmed and a whole range of others. And Zaki, I'm using him because he has declared that he would wish to stand as an independent. The reality is that out of a parliament of 400 members, despite all the difficult and regulatory hurdles which are going to be placed in the path of people to participate, once they are elected, if they are elected, it's going to be very difficult to enforce the kind of oversight and accountability which we require in order to improve governance. Now, why do I bring in the question of governance? And I'm not sneaking governance in through the back door. There is a direct relationship between them. My axiom is always that governance is a byproduct of politics. It can't exist before politics. So even in authoritarian countries, there must be a process of capturing or acquiring power. In democracies, you compete for it. In other systems, you capture it or you seize it. And so governance only follows after a process of politics. And it therefore stands to logical reason that if your politics are bad, the byproduct, governance, is going to be equally bad, which is the short way of saying that we have bad politics. We have incredibly poor politics. It is now characterized by crude identity politics. There is a weird and crude revanchist approach, even in the majority party, the governing party. And this revanchist recidivism was displayed in the way in which they adopted a stance to the electoral reform debate, but it's also the way in which they profligately abuse the trust of the public when it comes to a whole range of other policy issues, whether it be on the economy, whether it be on basic services, or whether it indeed be, as Rashad and others have pointed out, whether people are still using pit latrines and learning under trees. Is there a relationship between those outcomes and the nature of the electoral system? Absolutely there is. In a pure proportional representation system, where all elected representatives are entirely dependent on pleasing their party masters to remain on the list or to be elected into public office, they owe fidelity to no one but the party. And if the party is as a fragmented, fractious, problematic, as the governing party and others are, it's automatically going to be reflected in the political system. And it means that the ability of independent institutions like Parliament to conduct the robust oversight which is required falls away. Allow me to tell you that if we had a different electoral system and if we had a less crude politics, we may not have needed the Zondo Commission, because Parliament would have been able to play the role that it should have played at the time. But nevertheless, you've had the Zondo Commission, but guess what? A senior leader in the governing party, who called for the Zondo Commission, by the way, is now prepared to interdict it and take it on judicial review if they are going to be brought to task on this. So that should tell you, to return to the axiom, the nature and kind of politics that we have. Politics, again, I repeat, characterized by the desire for power without any responsibility, a desire for authority without any accountability. And that has been bred purely by this electoral system. Will there be a change in the nature of the electoral system? Potentially, there might be. And there may be a change in the electoral system depending on what the incentive structure is for the governing party. If they believe in this pure proportional representation system, where major voter stay away means that the proportion of other parties is shown up even though there isn't bigger voter migration to them, the proportionality principle means that their overall share is going to decline and they will have difficulty in cobbling together a majority to hold office. In that case, they will then decide to go to an electoral system or a type of electoral system in which their returns are higher than they currently are, and that they can cobble together a majority. So that's the one scenario in which a real thoroughgoing electoral reform may come about. Is there a need for it? Absolutely. And I think there genuinely does need to be a move away, not just from proportionality, because it is inclusive, it is diverse, and all of that. And it allows for a great amount of inclusivity in the system, but it has had very poor outcomes in terms of governance. And we definitely need to move towards a more constituency-based system. The reason why is, even though you will still have fragmentation, you will still have polarization, at least people in defined constituencies will now bear the responsibility and the agency of electing people into office. Should it be balanced by some degree of proportionality? Yes, absolutely. But it must simply be a top-up. Can you have direct elections with a proportional outcome? Yes, it's possible. It has been proposed. But the parties are not serious about this because it doesn't suit their purposes, it doesn't suit their interests. A final word on this, in trying to relate the issues of the electoral system to broader politics and governance, is I want to take issue with a few things which have been said by panelists before. And I want to echo what Rashad was saying about the EFF. It is not a left-wing movement. There's nothing left-wing about the EFF. In fact, the EFF can be summarized in the following way. And I like to call it, the 5 Ds and an O. And why do I call it the 5 Ds and an O? Because the EFF is all about destabilization. That's the first D. It is all about distraction. It's taking exactly the old colonial mentality by dividing and ruling in terms of the approach to government and society. It is disruptive, it is destabilizing, it wants to destroy and dislodge those who are currently in power, and it pursues those 6 Ds because it can then occupy office. And this is purely about the megalomaniac approach to money and power that characterize them. Unfortunately, they have found happy accommodation, and Mr. Malema and his cohort have been rehabilitated by no less than the ANC, its previous supposed enemies. So that's the character of what we're facing. Firstly, secondly, is that civil society has not always been and is not always as progressive as we are. And why is it that we're currently facing possibly what is Phala 2 is giving rise to state capture number 3. And again, there has been a shielding of the president from any kind of accountability. And this has been enabled by the political system, but it has also been enabled, even though the Section 89 report was defeated in Parliament, which is appropriately where it should have been defeated. Interdicting the thing in court was the wrong move, because what it showed is that you had executive power which wanted to ride roughshod over, as undesirable as it was, the independent approach that Parliament took to this investigation. So again, you have a party, and we don't have a presidential system, but you had a party which came to the defense of its president, and the ANC always behaves this way. The president becomes a monarch, literally, and they are always shielded from any kind of accountability and oversight. And so civil society in its early guise post the Zuma era fell precisely into that trap. And there are some people who are arguing that some of that civil society action was actually as factionalized as the ANC, and civil society was being used, in fact, to fight proxy battles, proxy factional battles inside the ANC, and that's the purpose that it was used. So what we do need, and I'm not saying that we don't have independent civil society, we absolutely do, but we need a much more robust independence in civil society, cut away from any ties to the current set of political movements. And the reason why I started off with the question of suspicion of the political parties, it's the only way in which civil society can play its role as a check and balance in the political system, is to keep an extremely robust independence away from it. The third is, Imran spoke about the politics of patronage. I have a view which says that the politics of patronage is appropriate I think it's okay for political parties to get into office, because the reason you get into office is to direct public resources to a constituency in society. So in that sense, patronage politics is entirely appropriate. The problem is we don't have patronage politics. It's a mischaracterization. What we actually have is predatory politics. And the reason people want to get into office is that public office offers the route to predation. And so if you are able, like any predator does, to access public office, then you can predate as much as you possibly can. And that is the nature and character, unfortunately, of our current politics. So the electoral system has partly enabled this. We need to definitely break up this concentration of proportionality in the electoral system. Despite its inclusivity and diversity, it is clearly not producing any desirable public outcomes for public government. It has literally, in any area of public life, enabled impunity rather than accountability, and has licensed the kind of adage of power without responsibility and authority without accountability.
And then that's it, Ibrahim. Yeah.
That's it for me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Right. Maybe just two quick questions before we wrap up. So one, picking up on your point about you saying we currently have bad politics, right? How then do we shift to good politics?
Well, the one way is to be less crude about identities, particularly about race and the other wokery which has been bandied around in the society, because it is narrow, it fetishizes biological determinants of who and what you are and what you're capable of, and therefore you are either requiring of special treatment or you must be denounced with every inch of contempt that people can muster because you don't fit the right identity. And that has animated, race is a real problem in our society. No one's denying that. And no one's saying that that mustn't be solved. It has to be. The reality here is that identities have been used as instruments of political capital rather than as public policy problems which can be resolved through redistribution. And redistribution can only happen if you have effective government. In fact,
can you give us an example of that? I mean, the identity you refer to.
Race is a simple example. Gender is another simple example. Sexual identity, another simple example. So you can take any identity and it becomes used as an instrument of political. The bean counting even went on to things like ethnicity and so on. So this is the example. There must be such punitive representativity in everything that you will bean count, how many whites, how many blacks, etc. Now, the reality for me, and this is where I think there's a big misnomer about what things like reconciliation mean and so on. Coming from a BC background as I do, the question of whites, of minorities, if you want to use that ugly term, etc., of the status of any of them in society is actually in the 22nd century, in the eve of the century, a misnomer. It's an irrelevant question. Because for me, the question of reconciliation is to make those people use their skills and put them to work in the society rather than exclude them. So that's what I mean when I talk about this kind of approach, crude and narrow approach to identity politics, firstly. Secondly, you have to get away from the crude abuse of majoritarianism, particularly in public institutions. Here, you're talking about the ANC, and let's be blunt, using its majorities to shield any kind of probity, whether it was on Nkandla, whether it's on the delivery of textbooks, whether it's about fixing public health care and hospitals, or indeed whether it was about state capture. If you had independent, robust parliaments doing the kind of work that a parliament does, all of those would have been completely unnecessary. So that's the second. Move away from crude majoritarianism, move away from crude identity politics. Third, ensure that if you get into public office, you have people who have some broad fidelity to principles. Here you have absolutely none. It is a purposeless politics. It is a politics which is without purpose, which is to access public office, as I say, for pure predation. Now, if you have that kind of politics continuing and defended to some extent, and in some cases even using organs of civil society to fight those internal battles in those parties, then you will get the kind of outcomes that we have. So unfortunately, no individual can fix, no individual has solutions to how to fix this. It requires some kind of collective effort. The problem is that once you are in these collectives, there are people who cynically use, abuse, manipulate the sentiment to achieve a particular kind of outcome, which is why I think any design of the electoral system must take power right back to the individual and the person. And if they return particular kinds of individuals into parliament, well, that's the agency and irresponsibility that they chose. So for me, those are the four things. A, electoral reform by giving the greatest amount of power to individual voters at the lowest level. Second, to move away from the crude identity politics. Third, to move away from crude majoritarianism. And fourth, to ensure that people have to also get serious about how they deliberate and what discretion they use when they make an electoral choice.
Okay, second last question before we wrap up. I found it quite amusing how you described the president's role becomes a monarch now, and then he's shielded as a monarch, perhaps without just singing the national anthem of, God save the president, something, right? What does the president do? I mean, what is the role of a president?
The role of the president is to be a steward and to guide the society in a particular direction and to take your party along if you come from a party to do so. That's the role of the president. The role of the president is also to ensure that they lead by example, that if they want accountability, that they themselves must be accountable. If they want answerability, then they themselves must be answerable. If they want responsibility, they themselves have to be responsible. And unfortunately, what we have is people speaking from both sides of their mouth. So, for example, the recent cabinet reshuffle. On the one hand, you'll hear people saying it's the prerogative of the president. No, it's not. The party has determined what should happen. The center of gravity has shifted back to the party, like it or not. And the party is now determining what must happen. So they tell the president what must happen. People in cabinet who you don't like, who call you a liar, who say you're useless, who say that your government is anti-ANC, that you are a product of white monopoly capital, that you facilitate white monopoly capital, that you are a stooge, and so on, they remain in your cabinet. You champion the idea that we are going to reform, we are going to incept a policy of reform based on what the Zondo Commission says. Well, a senior cabinet member of yours, who you retain in the cabinet, says they will interdictate this thing if it goes ahead. So which is it? Then you say that we need a particular minister to usher in fixing Eskom and power generation. 3 ministers, one within the presidency, could not fix this. Why is this a question of coordination and cohesion between ministers, when actually it's a governance and a policy problem which is inherited because of underfunding, under-budgeting, allowing and facilitating. The fact that I said you don't need politics now, but you need to understand what's going on in society is criminology, is not by accident. Why is it that sabotage, cartels, gangs, etc., can, whether in construction, whether in other parts of infrastructure, whether in electricity, if those are not unraveled, and they couldn't be unraveled by 3 ministers, why is one going to be able to do that? So this is what I mean when you say you have there's a role for a president. But the president says and does in action precisely contrary to what the role of the president is and what we said we'd hope the president would do, but he didn't.
Or maybe the president is a waiter who takes orders, right? I mean, just that's the point. Here's the last one. We're going to just wrap up with Solly Moeng's question. Can the united coalition of civil society movements take to the streets to demand that the political parties tasked with amending the Electoral Act do so within reasonable time before 2024? Ibrahim? You need to just unmute yourself, Ibrahim. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm afraid the short answer to Solly's question is that's not possible. Can't happen before 2024. The political part, that horse has bolted a long time ago, and lots of people were making a noise about it, including people who were on this panel, Zakira, for example, who've been talking about this for years, from the time the court judgment had come out. yet very few people willing to listen. Now that the urgency of the matter is here, there's lots of people who are now interested in the question. But for 2024, I'm afraid it's far too late. And you may well have a real problem in that there may not be an appropriate electoral system, or any electoral system for that matter, to run the 2024 election. Solly was asking earlier on, is there a possibility of postponing the 2024 election? No, there's no such possibility. There was an attempt to do so in 2021 under COVID conditions. I made a submission to the then Moseneke inquiry to actually argue for why there should be a postponement, a very limited postponement with strict timelines for that particular contingency, and yet the Constitutional Court has ruled that's not possible. So there's no possibility of this not happening. But this is the invidious precipice that the political parties, all of them, by the way, in Parliament have taken us to, where we don't actually currently, as we speak, have an electoral system under which to conduct the 2024 election. But any thoroughgoing, any new reform for 2024 is impossible.
Okay, got that. Ibrahim Fakir, thank you for your time. Most appreciated. As always, wonderful, important insights that does take the discussion forward. Whether it actually takes South Africa forward is another whole debate in its own right. Just before we wrap up, we're going to have the final word, of course, right? The request is for those who are off camera, if you can get on camera even for a minute, just so that we can do a screen grab of all of you in this gallery. If you can, it'll be great. If you do just that, even for a minute or so, that's every one of you, if it's really possible, right? Now, talking about the presidents, we're going to stay with the president. Solly Suleiman is the president of the Menara Chamber of Commerce. So you got the final word, and maybe that's the role of the president, as always, the last word.
Jazakallah, thanks, Ashraf. Assalamu alaikum, good evening. On behalf of the directors of the Menara Chamber, it is really my privilege to extend our thanks and appreciation to our moderator, Ashraf, our panelists, Ibrahim Fakir, Imran Bakkes, as well as Zakira Wadi, as well as Rashad Amra, for participating in this really interesting and important discussion, especially relevant to the citizens of this phenomenal country of ours. It has been very interesting, very interesting and a thought-provoking session, and we hope that many similar discussions will be held over the next year. If our participants have any ideas of any particular expert or analyst they believe will add value to our citizens and our members and the community, then I suggest you send the information to Amina on the KZN at minara.org.za, KZN at minara.org.za. It will also be important for us to engage the leadership of the various political parties in the future as well. On the spur of the moment, I thought it would be a great idea to listen to Ibrahim and Imran, who have always been very interesting analysts, and their opinion pieces are very incisive, hard-hitting, and do not mince their words. Ashraf, as moderator, manages these types of conversations very professionally, and of course, being the founder of Champion South Africa, is passionate about building South Africa, and that's phenomenal. I'm glad that Zakira and Rashad have joined this conversation and really added substantial value to this session this evening. Of course, I'd like to extend thanks to Mohammed Kaji and Asli for the support, advice, and guidance, which has ensured a successful outcome. And after all, we all have the same vision for a better South Africa. And of course, our kingpin or queenpin, Amina, as usual, quietly and efficiently actions what we discuss. And of course, she is the foundation of the Menara Chamber. I'd like to thank all of you for having joined us this evening to this phenomenal and important webinar. Assalamu alaikum, good evening, and of course, enjoy the long weekend ahead. Hopefully, it's not too stressful. Jazakallah, assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for that long weekend. I thought Monday was a working day, but I won't even go there. But fine. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Solly. Right, just some homework. I think for the Menara side. Well, use that hashtag essay the way forward. Right, it's really important. Feel free to communicate with the Menara Chamber as Solly has suggested. From a Champion South Africa point of view, in my role as like the champion spotter, we constantly looking out for people and organizations who are doing things that really takes the country forward. So if you have any thoughts and ideas around that, perhaps the best way just to drop me an email. I mean, you can contact me on any social media platform, but otherwise just via email, ashraf@championsouthafrica.coza, ashraf@championsouthafrica.coza. But otherwise, you'll find us on all the various social media platforms, right? Perhaps the last thing, and I'll go back to that goal of a champion nation because it fits in squarely with all the things that concern us. It is the absence of a working nation, a broken nation, a presence of a broken nation that gets us to where we are right now, isn't it? And one of the conversations I've often had, and we had it again today, is this, right? One thing South Africans are not doing, even from school level all the way to the top, is there's not enough attention focused on personal purpose. If people find their purpose in numbers, it'll change the entire approach to a whole range of different things, okay? So one is personal purpose, and the other one that's really important is national purpose. I've asked this question before, what is our national purpose? And as a way of an example, around the 1980s, late 80s, it was end apartheid, right? Or free Mandela. Then it was nation building around 1994. Probably 2010 was, 2010 World Cup. Since then, what is the glue that keeps us together? What is our national purpose? And I can tell you now, we don't have consensus on that. So a lot of attention has to be put to discovering and effectively igniting people to think along what is the national purpose, what is your personal purpose, and then very importantly, to make the link for you, that can you link your personal purpose and therefore your personal success to the national purpose and the national success. If you can't do that, we'll be having the same conversation, sadly, in 2 decades from now. But I don't want to have that conversation. I would rather have a conversation about South Africa being a champion nation. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time. From the Minara side, great that you guys have put this together. Great from my side to collaborate from a champion South Africa perspective. And I've heard the words that lots more collaborations and conversations around this time will take place. Why? Because it's so darn important. We just cannot ignore it. And perhaps maybe a final thought here. We in those conversations, a lot of attention has to be focused on getting the youth to be in the audience and to get the youth up as the presenters. It is that important, and it is the absence of that really keeps South Africa behind. We have to change that paradigm, and we have to change it big time. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for your time. We'll do it again some other time. Good night, good evening, and yeah, whenever we meet again, think of that hashtag SA the way forward, and let's find ways to really take South Africa and put it forward to a level that pleases every one of us that lives in it. Goodbye, good night, and assalamu alaikum.